Available in more than 100 million homes. Created by cable. Provided as a public service. Washington Journal continues.
Fox News national correspondent Catherine Herridge joins us. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Having me.
Author of a new book, The Next Wave on the Hunt for Al-Qaeda's American Recruits. You are covering terrorism. You've not only covered, you were in New York when 9/11 happened.
That's right.
You've covered what's happened in the years since then. And you start off your book by asking a question. You share an anecdote of being down at Guantanamo, and you ask, who is in control, us or the terrorists? Why do you ask that question?
Well, I asked that question because when I was at Guantanamo Bay, and one of the things I try and do in the book is sort of take you along in the investigation. So I take you into the courtroom, I take you to Fort Hood, San Diego, parts of Virginia to investigate this new generation. I call it Al-Qaeda 2.0. There is sort of a tension in the book between who's in control, us or the terrorists, because what we see with this new generation is that they're really using our technology against us in a way that we never saw a decade ago. I call them the new digital jihadist, and the person at the center of that is this American in Yemen called Anwar al-Awlaki. And this is someone who, whether he's emailing or he's blogging or his lectures are on YouTube, he's kind of like the Facebook friend from hell, and that's how he spreads this ideology of hate.
And you have linked him in a variety of ways throughout the book to a lot of the terror suspects and terrorists who have perpetrated things over the last decade. Take us through how connected he is and how you see him at the center of a web.
Well, the book really began with a very simple question. One of my colleagues at Fox asked me after Fort Hood, how is it that Americans who are old enough to remember 9/11, less than a decade later, are willing to turn their back on their own country? And that question really gave me pause, because I thought back to 9/11 and seeing the collapse of the towers and what happened at the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, and I couldn't really get my mind around it. And the more I investigated it, the more I found that you had the fingerprints of this American cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, who has now become more of a household name, but who at that time was really virtually unknown. And what you see in many of these cases, like the case we saw in Seattle last week, is that these individuals who are homegrown or self-radicalized, they're followers of his lectures and his ideology on the web.
And he knew some of the 9/11 terrorists, and he is someone who actually went to engineering school here in the United States. He was born in the United States, went overseas, and came back for school, and then became a cleric, a leader. How has he been able to make these connections and find people who are interested in his message?
Well, one of the major, I think, revelations in the book is that based on interviews with the agents who followed Awlaki after 9/11 and some recently declassified documents, to me the evidence is really overwhelming that he was an overlooked key player in 9/11 itself. And I began that part of the investigation about a year ago when I interviewed the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, who said to me, Catherine, there's always been a question that bothered the commission and the investigators. Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar are two of the 9/11 hijackers, and they were the first two hijackers into the United States in January of 2000. And Philip Zelikow said to me, why would Khalid Sheikh Mohammed send two of his most experienced operatives who spoke no English, not only to Southern California, but to the ghetto of San Diego, unless there was someone there to meet them? And that person was the American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. He was born in New Mexico. He left as a small child and returned to Yemen. Then he came back here for a college education and became the imam of the mosque in San Diego, where he met one-on-one with the hijackers in an anteroom there. And I have been inside that anteroom, and I can tell you that this is a very small and private and intimate place. And the documentation and the interviews I lay out in the book show that Awlaki's contacts with the hijackers, not only in San Diego, but also at the mosque here in Virginia, were not a series of coincidences, but really evidence of a very purposeful relationship.
Catherine Herridge is our guest, a national correspondent with Fox News. We're talking about her new book. How real is the threat of homegrown terrorism in the United States? We've heard a lot in the past decade about people coming over from overseas. You mentioned some of the 9/11 hijackers spoke no English, I mean virtually no English. But you're writing about a new generation, which you've called 2.0, people who perhaps were born in the United States or who are second generation. Talk to us about how you perceive that threat.
Well, the sense after bin Laden's death is that was kind of the end of the story in the war on terror. But what I lay out in the book is that this next chapter may in fact be even harder to fight, because what you find at the center of it are these American citizens, whether it's the cleric in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki. Remember, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen is where we had the last two major attempted attacks on the United States, the underwear bomber and then also the cargo printer bomb plot last year. And then there's also the al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, where you also see an American, quite senior in the ranks, who's from Daphne, Alabama. So what I argue in the book is that the next chapter is really this new American generation. And this group in particular is a group that understands us and understands our systems and how to use those systems against us. And as one example, you remember back to the cargo printer bomb plot. The idea was that these printer cartridges packed with explosives would detonate over the eastern seaboard of the United States. And one of my counterterrorism contacts said to me that he believed that the devices had been timed based on either the FedEx or UPS tracking systems on the web, because there had been a dry run earlier in the year. And he said to me, you know, Catherine, only an American would think about using the web tracking system for packages to launch a plot like this. So you see, the threats of the future may not be on the same scale as what we saw in 9/11, but it has a component which is more insidious because they understand our systems and they understand us as well.
Let's get to the phones. Ryan joins us from Portland, Maine on the Independent line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
I would say the most insidious thing is when the media refuses to look at the actual history of things, once reports that Anwar al-Awlaki dined at the Pentagon after 9/11 and then refuses to follow it up, and now is beating the drum for this homegrown terrorism, which is really where these attacks were really directed at demonizing the American people and the very idea of freedom. So I wish you would straighten out some of these obvious contradictions in the story about this supposed new Emmanuel Goldstein character, Anwar al-Awlaki. We all understand around the world, anyone who's looked into it, that these have been myths perpetrated on the United States. 9/11 was a psyop dedicated at reducing our ability to be sovereign individuals and sovereign nations. So could you please comment on Anwar al-Awlaki having lunch at the Pentagon?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I was the reporter who broke that story about Anwar al-Awlaki's lunch at the Pentagon. As you probably know, because you've been following it, that was in February of 2002, and what I show in the book through documents that we obtained through the Freedom of Information Act is that he was the guest of the Office of General Counsel, and that nearly 80 people were invited to that lunch. What I think is important here is that it shows to me a pattern. At that time, Anwar al-Awlaki was sort of like an imam around town here in Washington and was sort of feted as a moderate Muslim. But what I argue in the book is that the evidence was to the contrary. For example, I reveal documents that show that right after 9/11, in that first 8 days, he was interviewed at least 4 times by the FBI. So there was this sort of split view of him here in Washington at the very least. On the one hand, people were highly suspicious of his contacts with 3 of the 9 hijackers on Flight 77, and then on the other hand, he was seen as sort of a moderate and go-to guy to sort of build a bridge between that world and the United States. And what I would also add, and I think you'll find interesting, is that for me, writing about that lunch at the Pentagon was really upsetting on many levels, because when you look at Anwar al-Awlaki's contacts, it was with 3 of the 5 hijackers on Flight 77, and that was the flight that slammed into the Pentagon. So when Anwar al-Awlaki was invited back there to lunch as a guest speaker on Islam and politics, to me it was like a thief returning to the scene of the crime, and you could imagine someone like Awlaki walking the corridors of that building and in some respects marveling at the destruction that his guys were responsible for.
Wheeling, West Virginia. Ron is on our Independent line.
Yeah, I was wondering how you feel about how infiltrated we are in our country because of our immigration policies and the lack of following up on these people. And I mean, for years and years, we've had people coming into our country freely. How infiltrated do you think we are, and to what levels?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. One of the things I lay out in the book is that Anwar al-Awlaki, especially when he was in San Diego, he had, I'll call him a helper. He was a Yemeni national called Modar Abdullah, and it's not a name that's familiar to many people, but it's well known within counterterrorism circles because this Yemeni national was a facilitator for the hijackers in San Diego. He helped them find apartments and get jobs at a gas station and get licenses, all of those sort of things to help these two people who spoke no English settle in early 2000. And Modar Abdullah is interesting because he came here as a bogus asylum seeker. He said he was a Somali refugee. He was actually a Yemeni national, and at one point he also claimed to be an Italian citizen. So certainly during that period there was an effort to exploit our immigration system, and there was also an effort by the American Anwar al-Awlaki to exploit our system against us. I lay out in the book how Awlaki was able to lie and get $20,000 in scholarship money. He claimed to be a foreign student when he went to school in Colorado, but in fact he would never have been eligible for that money if they had known he was an American citizen. So you do see a pattern of fraud, and again, people using our system against us.
Let's follow up on that. You mentioned he was an American citizen,
Correct.
Actually, but he'd gotten this scholarship opportunity by
Right.
seeming to be a foreign.
That's right.
Foreign-born. But you also document how law enforcement officers tried to figure out a way to get him on violations.
That's right.
So you talk about how there was an observation that he'd actually sort of put the wrong Social Security number
correct.
on a passport application. And so this was a way that when he came back in the country, law enforcement officers could get him.
Right.
But when he came back in the country, they didn't. So take us through what you think that means and what the significance of that is.
Asked that. Right after 9/11, Anwar al-Awlaki was a high priority target at the JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force in San Diego, because of his contacts with three of the hijackers. And I interviewed the case agent who put that arrest warrant together. And when Anwar al-Awlaki had come here as a student to go to university, he had claimed to be a foreign national to get the scholarship money, and at the same time he had lied about his place of birth on his Social Security application. So,
which all doesn't really seem like a huge, I mean, it's not, not like a giant thing that you could lock someone away for the rest of their life for, but this is significant because?
It was significant because every time he used that Social Security number when he went to apply for an American passport, it was a continuation of the fraud. So to get this arrest warrant, the idea was not to set some precedent about prosecuting passport fraud. It's what people in law enforcement would call a holding charge. You want to be able to pick this person up for whatever it is and then put some pressure on them. And what I write about in the book, I think, is probably the most newsworthy elements of the Awlaki case. In October of 2002, he entered the United States, and he was held at JFK International Airport for 3 hours because there was this outstanding warrant for his arrest, until an FBI agent in Northern Virginia ordered his release, though the warrant was still active for his arrest. And what I show in the book is that the events surrounding October 2002 were likely withheld from the 9/11 Commission and from Congress. And based on the evidence I've seen, there are really only three possibilities. One is that the FBI was trying to make him an intelligence asset. Number two, they already believed he was a friendly contact. Or number three, they were trying to track him for intelligence. And I argue in the book that things didn't go well for obvious reasons. Look where he is today, because I have yet to meet a member of Congress when I show them these arrest warrants and the circumstances under which that warrant was pulled that's familiar to them.
Let's go to Ben Salem, Pennsylvania. Judith, Democratic caller.